Hey tea heads, this is Don from Mayleaf. Do you find the names of teas confusing? You can't distinguish between your Huangshan Maofeng and your Bingdao Gushu Pua? Well, today we're going to be diving into the fascinating yet murky waters of naming conventions in tea. First, a little sip of Heaven Surveyor. Right, before we jump in, a few notes from the outset. Firstly, this is going to be an overview, and like everything in tea, there are going to be some outliers and exceptions to these guidelines. Secondly, I'm going to be mainly focusing on Chinese, Japanese, and Taiwanese teas in this video, but you can still apply a lot, if not most of this guide to other tea growing countries too. Okay, so let's start with some basic definitions to lay down some foundations for our discussion. You can broadly divide teas into 4 levels of classification. The first level is the tea type, which is defined by how a tea leaf is processed after picking. There are 6 tea types. I'm not talking about tisanes, I'm talking about teas here. So there are 6 tea types: white, green, yellow, oolong black, and post-fermented. If you want to learn more about the definitions of these types, then go check out our Foundations of Tea series. I'll stick a link in the description below. So every single tea can be classified by its type. That part is pretty simple, and you will see this information on 99% of tea packaging out there. The next level is the name of the tea, and that's the level that we'll be discussing in great detail today. The third level is the season of picking. All teas should have the picking date or season written on the packaging. And we'll be comparing tea with wine naming conventions shortly, but it is worth saying here that a big difference between the two drinks is that the grapes made to use wine are almost always picked only once per year, whereas tea has a whole other array of complexity because it is made of leaves and not fruits, and therefore it can be picked during multiple seasons of the year. And so season is much more complex in tea. The fourth and final level is the batch. Now this is a bit more complicated, but refers to the actual batch of tea that was picked and processed at one time. For example, even if you have a spring harvest green tea from a particular tea farm, they will probably have multiple rounds of picking during that one spring season as the plant continues to grow rapidly after they pick. Now, each round of picking will be processed separately to make a batch of tea, and the processing will be altered slightly depending on the weather of that particular day or the quality of that round of picking. So each batch is going to be different, even if it is the same tea season, the same tea name, and the same tea type. Now, sometimes batches are blended to make a blended batch of tea, but all of this adds to more complications. So there are hundreds of thousands of batches of tea produced each year. It is these batches or lots that we sample when we're curating our selection of Mayleaf tea. Okay, so you've got those 4 levels in your head. Now let's make the comparison with wine. In wine, the type of the wine is broadly split up into white, red, rosé, and orange wines. Forgive me if I'm not completely right, but you get the idea. So that's level 1, the type. The name of the wine will usually include the cultivar, which is the type of grape variety used, like Pinot Noir or Riesling or Cabernet Sauvignon, followed by the region, like Bordeaux or Napa, and finally, the producer or estate name. Now, the season is usually just a year, and there is not usually any batch details at all. So you don't get much detail on level 3 or 4. So let's say you've got a red wine, that's the type. You've got Le Pin, which is the producer, Pomerol, which is the region, and Merlot is the cultivar. So this is the wine's name. 2020 might be included, and that's the year. So this is the wine's season. And finally, there is not usually any further information regarding batches because Le Pin will produce usually 1 batch of 2020 Merlot every year. So wine naming is relatively simple. With tea, it's a lot more complicated. The type of tea is relatively easy, although some people may still argue about some classifications. All teas fall under those 6 tea types I talked about earlier: white, yellow, green, oolong, black, and post-fermented. But the naming of the tea, so the second level, can include so many other bits of information. These include the following. Origin. So just like wine, the terroir is fundamental to the quality of the tea, and there are areas which are rightly or wrongly renowned for producing better tea in any particular tea type. So you can be very broad by just naming the country and province, all the way to being very specific, like the actual village or the field that the tea was grown in. Another bit of information, just like wine, is cultivar. Again, like wine, the genetics of the plant are important in conveying what to expect when you buy a tea. This is an ultra complicated area, but I'm pretty sure that I'm right in saying that tea has many more cultivars than wine or coffee. We are talking thousands, depending on your sort of level of detail. The naming of cultivars vary wildly, from numbers attributed by sort of central tea authorities to very descriptive names about the look or history of the cultivar itself. Sometimes the name of the cultivar is a description of the aroma or flavor that it should have. This is usually the case for oolong teas. For example, Huangjie Xiang means gardenia flower aroma and refers to a cultivar which tends to produce tea with this aromatic quality. Another example is Jingui. Jingui translates to golden osmanthus. It's got nothing to do with golden osmanthus, but refers to a tea cultivar with a particular aroma of osmanthus. Another bit of information, just like wine, is producer, but this is much less commonly found in tea, although you do see this information in Darjeeling, for example, where the name of the estate is crucial information. The reason why producer or estate is less commonly used in tea is due to the chain of production in tea. A producer of tea is very rarely the same business as the seller. I mean, look at Mayleaf as an example. We do not physically produce our own tea. We buy from various farmers and producers who will produce other batches of tea for other tea suppliers, usually in the origin country like China, Taiwan, or Japan. So, given the sheer number of batches that a producer can make, as I said, it's not just one batch per season, it'll be multiple batches per season. It would be impractical for the producer to brand each batch as their own, and it would require them setting up a whole sales and marketing arm to their activities. Most producers have no desire to do this. Now, some companies may add the name of the producer in the description of a tea, especially if it's a single person or a family. But this is more for the sales and marketing narrative than to give any meaningful information to the client. That same family or single person may produce tea, well, almost certainly will produce tea for other sellers, and so the name doesn't have the same meaning as it does in wine, where you're talking about a particular estate. Another bit of information that might be included in the name is the overall production style of the tea. Now, in wine, you may have some information about the style of production in the description, but it's usually not part of the name. I can think of examples, for example, Kvevri wine, apologies for my pronunciation, Kvevri wine shows a particular style of Georgian wild production, and that's sometimes baked into the name. But with tea, it is often included in the name. For example, sencha in Japan is a style of production which should go through some clearly defined steps. It should be spring-picked, steamed, and rolled. To make things more complicated, though, production style has become conflated with origin. For example, Longjing green tea is historically named after the area of Longjing Dragon Well in Zhejiang province in China. But nowadays, the name has come to represent a style of production of flat, pan-fried green tea. So in the same way as Beijing duck has come to describe a style of preparing duck, you know, the style of production has become conflated with the origin name. Now, some tea provinces are trying to protect the designation of their origin by banning the use of the name if a tea is produced in another region. But given the thousands of years of imitation and influence, this seems to be too little, too late. Another bit of information that's often included in the name of tea is the shape or look of the finished tea. So you may have heard terms of like Mao Feng, Mao Jian, or Gua Pian. These actually refer to the shape of the finished tea. This is why the same name can appear in multiple different tea types and styles. For example, in Anhui province, they produce a Mao Feng green tea and a Mao Feng black tea. The Mao Feng shape is basically unshaped, so that the leaves are not rolled or formed and therefore show off the downy peak of the picking. Mao Feng means downy peak. So the same word is used to describe multiple different teas, which can be very confusing for people. Another example is Jinjin Mei, which is often translated as golden eyebrow to describe the color and shape of the tea. So the look, the shape of the tea can often be used in the tea name. Now, shape and look is sometimes used to express the grade of the tea itself, but this is not a reliable marker of quality. As long as you're buying loose leaf and whole tea, then I wouldn't focus too much on these names to define grading. Another but similar bit of information that can be included in the name of the tea is the picking style. So similar to shape, picking style describes the look of the tea, but it is based on which parts of the plant have been picked more than how the tea has been shaped after picking. The classic example of naming a tea by its picking style is, of course, white tea. Silver needle or yin zhen is a white tea from only the silver buds of the plant, whereas Baimudan, for example, is a mix of buds and leaves. Indian teas use letters to describe the picking protocol, such as FTG, FOP, which stands for finest, tippy, golden, flowery, orange, pico. But again, just like shape, picking style is often linked to the grade of the tea by some sellers, but I don't think that this is right. You know, the picking style will obviously change the character and taste and price of a tea, but there is no strict rule about one picking style being a higher grade than another, especially when you're talking about Chinese teas. So I would ignore the association between picking style and grade. Another bit of information that you may see in the name is the tree age. Some teas will include the broad age of the tea tree in their name. For example, Lao Tsong Shui Shen means tea made from the Shui Shen cultivar, so that's cultivar, but that cultivar or the picking comes from old bushes. Lao Tsong means old bush. This naming convention is often used in post-fermented tea types. For example, terms like Da Shu, meaning big tree, or Gu Shu, meaning ancient tree. And this matters because the age of the tea tree will dramatically change the character of the tea and the relative scarcity of its production. Another final bit of information that you may see, or almost certainly will see in tea names, is what I call umbrella groups. So while there are 6 basic tea types, as we talked about before, level 1, you can group teas within the same tea type into sort of more defined categories by incorporating multiple aspects under one umbrella term. For example, raw pu'er or sheng pu'er is a broad name for tea from the big leaf variety, so that's incorporating cultivar, produced in Yunnan, so that's incorporating origin, and is produced by pan frying and sun drying. So that's incorporating production style. So you're incorporating 3 aspects under one umbrella term. Another example is yencha or rock tea, which is a roasted strip oolong. So that's production style made around Wuyi Mountains. So that's origin. Or for example, dansong, which is another strip oolong production style made in Guangdong province, origin. So here you have it. These are the 8 most commonly used descriptors used in the naming of a tea: origin, cultivar, production style, shape and look, picking, tree age, umbrella groups, and to a much lesser extent, producer. Now, to add more complexity to this, they are often mixed up and conflated with each other. Remember that tea has millennia of history with no formal naming conventions, and so it is to be expected that there is so much variation and inconsistency in the naming processes. The objective for any tea lover is, of course, to understand the terms that they're seeing, to piece together an understanding of the tea. And there are some outliers, like the Oolong Dongfang Mei Ren, which is translated as Oriental or Eastern Beauty, and that's a name that was supposedly given by the Queen of England, and it just stayed with the tea. But these are unusual. Remember that these names do not describe anything about the season of picking. Of course, you may expect a particular tea to be picked at a particular season. For example, Anji Baicha is a green tea made with one of the albino, Bai means white, Baicha means white, so albino cultivars. So it's talking about the cultivar, and it's traditionally produced in Anji County, so that's the origin. But again, the term Anji is now just synonymous with that style, that production style of baked, fine picked tea. Now you should expect that Anji Baicha is picked in spring, but there's theoretically nothing stopping a producer making an Anji Baicha from summer flushes. So the name doesn't talk about the season in 99% of the cases. Also, these names say nothing about the quality and character of a particular batch of the tea. So if we stay with Anji Baicha, there will be hundreds of batches made of Anji Baicha during the spring harvest in Anji County itself in any particular year. And they will taste very different from each other. So the batch is a separate thing from the name of the tea. And that brings us to the final point here, which is how we name our teas at Mayleaf. We will always give you the traditional or conventional name of a tea on our packaging, but oftentimes the main name is much more about the actual batch that we are sourcing and its character. I think that this is much more useful for our clients than just repeating the conventional name of a tea simply because of the incredible variation that I talked about within a particular tea name across the batches. For example, a very specific tea, such as an unsmoked Lapsang Souchong black tea from the tiny village of Tongmu in Fujian, will have an insane variation of tastes of batches from fruity to chocolatey and malty, and we may source 5 to 10 batches of this particular tea every year. So rather than calling them all Lapsang Souchong, we instead give them batch names like Cocoa Malt Queen or Sweet Spice JJM. If we happen to find a batch the following year, which has a similar flavor profile to the previous batch, then we will keep the name going, but otherwise we will just change the name to denote a different experience for the drinker. Again, we will always show you the traditional name so that you can sort of compare it with other teas that you're finding on the market, and we'll provide more detailed information, which we call scope, which stands for season, cultivar, origin, picking and processing style, and elevation. So I feel that this gives you the most comprehensive level of information for any tea. Right. Before we go, let's quickly apply all that we have learned today to some common tea names so that you can start to sort of unpick them and understand them better. I'll just choose one tea from each tea type in our collection. So white tea. Let's start with Simple Dreams Fuding Shoumei 2018. So Simple Dreams is our batch name. Fuding is the origin, location of the tea. Shoumei is the picking style of larger leaves, and 2018 is a date of production, which is included in the name because white tea can be aged, and so it needs to have an age statement. Green tea. Let's use Melon Seed Green, also known as Luan Guapian. Melon Seed Green is our batch name, but is also a translation of the Chinese name. Now, we've a particular taste profile in mind that we're looking for when we're sourcing this tea, and there has been very little variation across the years. So we're happy to call the batch name the translation the translation of the Chinese. Luan is the historical origin of this tea, and Guapian describes the shape of the leaves, although I see no resemblance to melon or sunflower seeds. But once again, Luan Guapian has become adopted as a style of picking and production, and you can get Luan Guapian from other areas. Yellow tea, Diamond Peak, Junshan Yinjian. Diamond Peak is the batch name. Junshan is the historical island where the tea was originally produced, and Yinjian is the style of picking, as it is mostly buds. Again, hardly any of the Junshan Yinjian that you see on the market is actually made on Junshan Island, as the area is tiny and mostly reserved for government officials. So the tea produced there is mostly reserved for government officials. So the name refers again to a style of production, but ideally it should be produced near Junshan. Quick sip of some Heaven Surveyor. Okay, moving on to oolong tea. Let's use soursap as an example. So the batch name is soursap, and the conventional name is tuosuen tieguanyin. Tuosuen is the production style of waiting a longer period of time for the leaves to be processed in order to produce a more sour taste. And tieguanyin should refer to the cultivar, although it has now become conflated with any type of ball-rolled oolong from Fujian, no matter what the cultivar. Again, this is the problem, that the names of the origins of the cultivars become conflated with other things. Black tea. Let's talk about Bailu Gold, also known as Huangjin Bailu. Bailu Gold is the batch name. Huangjin means yellow gold and describes the look of the leaves. Bailu actually refers to the season of picking, called white dew, in September. So this is an example of an exception where the actual name includes the season as part of the name. Let's move on to post-fermented tea. Dram Alchemist, also known as Mengfei Gushu Raw Pu'er Spring 2021. Pu'er teas tend to have the longest naming protocols. So Mengfei is the specific village of production, so that's the origin. Gushu refers to the age of the tea trees, ancient tea trees. Raw Pu'er is that umbrella group that I was talking about before for pan-fried, sun-dried tea made from the big leaf cultivar in Yunnan. So there's a lot to get in, so we just call it Raw Pu'er. And the date again is included because Pu'er is prized for aging and therefore requires an age statement for clarity. Finally, let's do one ripe tea. Bling Rock Kingpin, Gongting Zhejuan Ripe Pu'er 2014. Bling Rock Kingpin is the batch name. Gongting refers to the finest picking style, so it's a picking style of buds and young leaves. Zhejuan is the cultivar. Ripe Pu'er is the umbrella group of Pu'er tea, which we talked about before, but which has been ripened and it's gone through a composting process or a ripening process. And 2014 again is the year of production. Phew, I hope that this has been useful for you, and why don't you have a go at deciphering names yourself to see how you get on. As I said, there are probably other naming conventions out there, so please feel free to write down your additions in the comments below. Please remember that while names of teas can be confusing, they just take time and practice to figure out, and don't get overwhelmed by them. Ultimately, they're only there for the purpose of giving you an idea of the type of tea that you are buying. The determination of quality is entirely different and entirely personal. That's it, tea heads. Check out our other videos, taste our teas wherever you are in the world by browsing mayleaf.com, and come visit us if you're ever in London. Other than that, I'm Don from Mayleaf. Thank you for being a part of the revelation of true tea. Stay away from those tea bags, keep drinking the good stuff, and spread the word, because nobody deserves bad tea. Bye.